When I asked him to massage my shoulders that evening, I didn't think it would mean anything. I didn't dress differently. I didn't light candles or turn on soft music. It was just an offhand comment, said with a tired smile and a laugh. My neck had been stiff for days, and he was there, reading on the couch, calm and present in a way I hadn't felt from anyone in months. Including my husband. He hesitated just for a second, before standing up and stepping behind me. His hands were warm. Firm, but gentle. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself exhale. I told myself it was innocent. That I was imagining the tension between us. That this was normal. But when his fingertips brushed the side of my neck, I felt something crack open inside me. Something raw. Unspoken. Forbidden. I leaned into it, just a little. And he didn't pull away. That's when I knew this wasn't going to stay simple. That evening changed everything. It didn't end in anything dramatic. No gasps or whispers. Just silence. A silence heavier than anything I'd ever known. Because 3 months ago, I crossed a line I swore I never would. And now, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. But let me tell you how it all happened, before this story turns into something much worse. Before I bury the truth so deeply, even I can't find it anymore. But first, leave a comment, where are you watching from? And tell me, have you ever asked for something innocent and gotten more than you bargained for? The house was quiet in that particular way it gets when familiarity turns into distance. We'd been married for over 20 years, and yet the silences between us now weren't comforting, they were hollow. My husband had always been a good man. Practical, loyal, responsible. But he'd also grown absent in a way I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding petty. He came home on time. Paid the bills. Made coffee in the morning. And somehow, I still felt alone. I didn't even realize how much I missed being seen until he moved in. My husband's son from a previous marriage, technically my stepson, though that word never fit. He was never a boy to me. He was already grown when we met. We barely knew each other, but after his own breakup, he needed a place to stay, and the guest room was empty. At first, I barely noticed him. He stayed out of the way, was polite, helpful. But the first thing I truly registered was how easily he looked at me. Not in a suggestive way, at least not at first, but attentively. As if I wasn't invisible. As if I still took up space in a room. One morning, he passed me in the hallway and casually said, "You look nice in that color." I was wearing an old blouse I'd nearly thrown out 3 times. I'd forgotten what it felt like to respond to a compliment without suspicion. I told myself it was nothing. But then I found myself wearing it again 2 days later. There was no plan. No flirtation. Just something in the air between us. Something shifting. Something I didn't want to name. It became easier to talk to him than to my husband. We'd bump into each other in the kitchen at odd hours, share tea or leftover cake. Our conversations were light, bordering on meaningless, but his attention never drifted. Unlike my husband, who often stared through me, absorbed in his phone or some distant problem from work. One evening, I mentioned that my neck had been sore all day. I'd been weeding the garden, leaning awkwardly under the lilac tree that had grown wild this year. Without thinking, I rubbed at the tension near my shoulder. He noticed. "You should let me fix that," he said. I took massage therapy for a while. Just a hobby, nothing formal. I laughed. "Oh, I'm sure you'd be better than me flailing around with a heating pad." "Anytime," he offered. "Really?" I almost forgot it after that. But 2 days later, after dinner, I said it. Casually, like I might ask him to grab something from the top shelf. My shoulders still bothering me. Think you could work your magic? He paused. Just for a second. I caught it. But then he smiled and said, of course. We went into the living room. My husband had already gone to bed early, tired from another trip out of town. The room was dim. The small lamp in the corner cast soft shadows. I sat down, facing away from him. His hands were warm. When he started, I expected it to be awkward. But it wasn't. He was careful, deliberate, never intrusive. And yet, I felt it. The quiet. The closeness. The weight of everything we weren't saying. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but I couldn't stop my thoughts from racing. Every inch of me that he touched seemed to light up something that had long gone dull. I closed my eyes. His thumbs worked a knot just beneath my shoulder blade, and I let out a breath that felt too much like a moan. I bit my lip. Focused on the sound of the clock ticking. On the way the rain tapped the window. When he stopped, I didn't want to turn around. But I did. He was looking at me. Not through me. Not past me. At me. And something passed between us. Unspoken. Irreversible. But nothing happened. No words. No touch. He nodded once and quietly left the room. I sat there, heart pounding, unsure of what I had just invited into my life. That night, I lay in bed, eyes open to the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. I tried to match it, to force myself to settle into sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Not my husband's. His. I told myself it was just loneliness. Just attention I wasn't used to. Just hormones. Just proximity. Just a bad moment. But the next morning, when I went downstairs and found him already making coffee, smiling at me the same way he always had, it didn't feel like just anything anymore. It felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready to name. The morning after that massage, everything felt both exactly the same and completely different. The sun came in through the same slats in the blinds. The kitchen smelled of the usual weak coffee my husband liked. The floor was cold beneath my bare feet. And yet, my body felt like it had been rearranged during the night. As if something inside me had shifted, quietly, permanently. I moved through the morning routine like always, but I was no longer just a woman in a marriage. I was someone who had let something happen, even if nothing really happened. And I couldn't stop replaying it. He was already downstairs when I walked in, leaning casually against the counter, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and smiled as if everything was normal, and maybe for him it was. But I felt like I was wearing someone else's skin. "Morning," he said simply. I nodded, murmured something. My hands moved automatically, mug, kettle, spoon, but my head was far away. I could feel his presence behind me even when he turned his back. The way he moved. The space he took up in the room. The memory of his hands on my shoulders. I kept my eyes on the counter, willing my heartbeat to slow. When my husband entered the kitchen, it was like someone hit the dimmer switch on my insides. Whatever current had been running through me flickered out. His presence brought order, predictability, and a sudden, sharp sense of guilt. He kissed the top of my head, barely brushing it, then grunted something about a meeting later than expected. I nodded. Smiled. Pretended. But pretending became harder with each passing hour. Throughout the day, I couldn't stop noticing how quiet it was when my husband was out of the house and how noisy it felt when my stepson was near. Every gesture seemed to carry weight, passing the salt at lunch, a glance when he asked if I needed anything from the store. I became hyper-aware of how close he stood when we talked, how his eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. And then, that afternoon, I found myself watching him from the window as he helped a neighbor with her car. Something about the way he leaned under the hood, his shirt clinging to his back, the way he smiled and laughed, made my chest tighten. I felt foolish for noticing. And even more foolish for caring that I had. I tried to distract myself, did laundry, sorted papers, reorganized the pantry. None of it worked. My thoughts kept spiraling back to the feeling of his fingers brushing my neck. The pause. The silence that followed. The weight of the air between us. By the time evening rolled around, I was raw with overthinking. I told myself we needed to clear the air. Set boundaries. Reinforce whatever lines we'd blurred the night before. But the words didn't come. And maybe I didn't want them to. After dinner, my husband retreated to his office upstairs. Some report to finish, he said. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to wipe down the counters long after they were clean. My stepson came in to put his plate in the sink, and for a moment, we stood side by side without speaking. Then, quietly, he said, about last night. I turned toward him slowly, my stomach clenching. I braced myself for a confrontation or a confession, but all he did was look at me with those same calm, unreadable eyes. I shouldn't have, he began. We kissed, I said, cutting him off. The words came out flat. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just a fact, laid bare between us. He didn't respond at first. Just nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. We did. We stood there, suspended in that moment, the silence growing heavier by the second. I don't know what it meant, I admitted, voice quieter than I intended. Neither do I, he said. And that was it. No resolution. No plan. Just mutual uncertainty. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed long after the lights were out, listening to the rhythm of the house, the creaks of settling walls, the soft hum of appliances, the muffled sound of my husband snoring lightly beside me. My hands were cold. My thoughts tangled. My chest felt tight in a way I couldn't explain. I kept thinking about how easy it had been. How a small, harmless thing had unraveled into something I couldn't contain. And yet, I hadn't pulled away. I hadn't stopped it. That truth sat in my stomach like a stone. In the days that followed, we both kept our distance. He left early in the mornings, didn't linger in the kitchen anymore. We stopped crossing paths at odd hours. And still, I could feel him in every room. My husband remained oblivious. Or maybe he just didn't want to know. He made a few more jokes than usual. Told me I looked tired. Offered to bring home wine one night. I nodded along, smiled when appropriate, said thank you. But part of me was somewhere else. I began to question myself constantly. Was I just flattered? Was it just boredom? Or was it something deeper, some dormant part of me that had been aching for attention, for connection, for the sense of being desired? One afternoon, I found myself flipping through old photos. Of our wedding. Of vacations. Of the house when we first bought it. My husband and I looked so young. So unburdened. I stared at one photo longer than the rest, me in a summer dress, laughing with my arms around his neck. We looked happy. We probably were. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad, exactly. Just distant. Like I was watching a memory that belonged to someone else. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I dropped a glass. It shattered across the floor, scattering in sharp little pieces. I knelt to clean it up, but my hands were shaking. I don't know why that moment broke me, but it did. Maybe because it was something real. Tangible. Dangerous. He came into the kitchen just as I was finishing. He knelt beside me, quiet. quietly picking up shards with his bare fingers. "You okay?" he asked. I didn't look at him. Just nodded. "Be careful," he added. "You're bleeding." I glanced down. A small red line on my thumb. I stood quickly, wrapped a towel around my hand, and mumbled something about it being fine. He didn't press. Just threw the glass into the trash and washed his hands. We didn't talk after that. But later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I knew this silence between us wasn't safety. It was fuel. And I didn't know how much longer we could pretend it wasn't burning. The shift between us had happened, undeniably, but neither of us knew how to carry it. After that night, after those words, after naming what we both pretended hadn't happened, everything settled into a strange kind of balance. Not peace. Not comfort. But silence. Delicate, loaded silence. He stopped lingering in shared spaces. If I entered a room, he found a reason to leave. If we crossed paths, we exchanged polite, neutral words, just enough to maintain civility. There were no more shared cups of tea in the kitchen. No more casual smiles over the back of a book. The warmth that had crept between us so easily was now sealed beneath layers of distance. It should have been a relief. It wasn't. My husband announced, with little ceremony, that he would be traveling again. Some conference or meeting or retreat. I didn't ask for details. I simply nodded, gave the obligatory safe travels, and waited for the moment he walked out the door. When he did, I stood at the window and watched his car disappear at the end of the street, feeling nothing but an ache I couldn't place. That evening, the house was too quiet. Not peacefully so, but eerily. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum louder, the clock ticking more pointedly. I sat in the living room with a book I couldn't focus on, my fingers resting between the pages for almost an hour without turning them. The air was thick with avoidance. I heard him in the kitchen. The clink of a glass, the creak of a cabinet. For a long moment, I sat frozen. Then I stood. Walked in barefoot, moving with the careful hesitation of someone entering uncertain terrain. He turned when he heard me, startled but composed. He held a mug of tea in both hands, as if it anchored him. "I didn't think you were still up," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I answered. I moved to the other side of the kitchen, opening a cabinet just for the sake of doing something. I stared at the shelves, at boxes of cereal we never ate, at half-used jars of spice I'd been meaning to toss. Anything but him. He took a sip from his mug, then set it down on the counter with care. I could feel his gaze on me. The silence stretched between us again, uncomfortable and magnetic. It was a silence filled not with nothingness, but with everything we weren't saying. "I've been thinking," he said finally, breaking it. I didn't respond. Just waited. "I think I should move out. Soon." Those words didn't surprise me, and yet they landed with unexpected weight. My hands tensed around the edge of the counter. "Is that what you want?" I asked quietly. "It's probably what's best." I nodded, eyes still on the spices. "Probably." And yet, I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel anything I could name, only an unsettled twisting in my stomach. He left the kitchen after that, and I remained, staring blankly ahead. The tea kettle began to whistle behind me. I hadn't even turned on the stove. That night, I lay in bed with the window cracked open. The cold air touched my skin in a way that made me feel awake, alert. I curled under the blankets and tried to remember the last time I had touched my husband without calculation. Not out of duty. Not out of guilt. Just touched him. I couldn't recall. Morning came slowly. I avoided breakfast, choosing instead to water the garden. The soil was hardening from the early fall chill, the plants turning brittle and tired. I knew I'd have to cut them back soon, prepare for the months ahead when everything would go quiet and dormant. Still, I dragged the hose across the yard and moved from bed to bed like it mattered. He came outside after a while. Said he was going to help a neighbor lift something heavy. I nodded. He left without further comment, and I remained kneeling in the dirt, hands coated in damp soil, knees aching. I stayed there long after I'd finished. It was easier than going back inside. By late afternoon, I was restless again. I tried to clean. I folded laundry. I reorganized the contents of a drawer that hadn't been touched in years. But nothing held my attention. The silence wasn't a reprieve anymore, it was an echo. Eventually, I found myself on the stairs, not even sure where I was going. My feet took me halfway up before I stopped. His door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, then moved past it quickly, as if not looking was the same as resisting. Dinner came and went without much fanfare. We barely spoke, each trapped in our own corner of the house. When he cleared his plate, I stayed at the table. When he left the room, I listened for the creak of each step as he ascended the stairs. I stayed up late, walking from room to room like a ghost. I opened the curtains in the living room. Rearranged a vase that didn't need moving. When I passed the mirror in the hallway, I paused. My reflection startled me. I didn't look guilty. I didn't look romantic. I looked tired. Hollow-eyed. There was a question in my face I couldn't answer. A quiet dare I didn't know how to decline. Later that night, I heard him moving. The floorboard creaked outside my bedroom. I knew the sound too well to be mistaken. My heart started to pound, not with anticipation, but with dread. A dread I didn't fully understand. The footsteps paused. Then retreated. I stared at the ceiling again, for what felt like hours, until my eyes stung. I didn't sleep. I didn't dream. I just floated. When morning broke, I was already awake. I went downstairs and made coffee. He wasn't there. His room was quiet. I left a cup for him anyway. On the counter. Right where he used to sit. And I didn't wait to see if he drank it. There was a strange clarity to the day that followed, like a window had been washed, and suddenly, everything looked too sharp. The air was colder, almost brittle, and even the sunlight felt thinner. I moved through the house as if I had something to do, though I didn't. I dusted things that didn't need dusting, folded blankets that had already been folded. Anything to keep my hands busy, because my mind refused to be still. He had said nothing more about leaving. No dates, no boxes, no signs of preparation. But the idea of his departure hung in the air like the scent of something burnt, stubborn and sour. I kept waiting to see suitcases near the door or hear him making phone calls about apartments, but there was nothing. Only silence. And that silence wasn't relief, it was waiting. Stretched out, taut, unbearable. In the afternoon, I escaped into the garden. The leaves had started to fall in earnest now, crisp and orange, carpeting the lawn like memory. I pulled on gloves and brought out the rake, dragging it through the yard in wide, angry motions. It helped. The physicality. The repetition. For a little while, I didn't think. Then I heard the screen door open behind me. I turned, expecting nothing, and found him standing there, one hand gripping the wooden frame like he wasn't sure if he should stay or go. "You need help?" he asked. I stared for a second too long, then nodded. "Sure. Grab a bag." He crossed the yard in a few strides and picked up the large paper sack meant for clippings. We worked in silence. Me raking, him gathering, both of us pretending this was just another chore. But every movement, every brush of his shoulder near mine, felt electric in a way I couldn't rationalize. Even the way he breathed beside me had changed, quieter, but somehow closer. At one point, I dropped the rake. Then to pick it up. He did too, and our heads nearly collided. We both laughed, reflexive, nervous. "Careful," I said, stepping back. "Yeah," he replied, straightening. But he didn't move further away. And I didn't insist. There was a moment, brief and unremarkable to any outside eye, where we just stood there, leaves swirling around our feet. His eyes met mine. Neither of us smiled. And yet everything was said in the space between heartbeats. Eventually, we went back to work. Later, as the sun began to drop behind the trees, he tied off the last of the leaf bags and stacked them neatly near the garage. I thanked him, and he nodded. That was all. Inside, the house felt warmer, like it had absorbed the day's tension. I made tea, poured 2 cups without asking if he wanted one, and set them on the table. He joined me without hesitation. It felt almost normal. Almost. We drank in silence again, but this time it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like a truce. Something unnamed but fragile settled over us. That night, I didn't sleep much. My body was tired from the yard work, but my mind buzzed. I kept thinking about how quickly things could shift. One minute we were raking leaves, the next we were inches apart, suspended in something wordless. It terrified me, how easy it was to fall into that space, how difficult it was to climb back out. The next morning, I decided to bake. Not out of craving, but instinct. There was comfort in measuring flour, cracking eggs, following steps. When he walked into the kitchen mid-morning, I was covered in flour and deep in concentration. He paused in the doorway. "Smells good." "Pumpkin bread," I said without looking up. "You can have the first slice if you don't complain about the mess." No complaints. He moved to the counter, leaned against it. I could feel his eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. I didn't look up. I couldn't. "When do you think you'll go?" I asked, keeping my voice light. He was quiet for a second. "Soon, probably." "Right." I slid the pan into the oven and closed the door a little too hard. He shifted behind me. "I don't want to make things harder." "Too late," I said before I could stop myself. The words fell like stones. He didn't respond. I finally looked at him. His expression was unreadable, and I hated that I couldn't tell what he was thinking. "I didn't mean," I started. "It's okay," he cut in. "I get it." But he didn't get it. Not really. He didn't know how long I'd felt alone. How often I'd sat in this very kitchen, staring at nothing, pretending everything was fine. He didn't know the quiet desperation I carried like an extra organ, one no doctor could remove. Still, I said nothing more. Neither did he. The bread rose slowly in the oven, scenting the air with cinnamon and something more bittersweet. When it was done, I sliced it while it was still warm, placed one piece on a plate, and pushed it toward him. He took a bite, closed his eyes briefly. "This is amazing." "Thanks," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. I left the kitchen before I could say anything else. Hours later, I found myself sitting in the living room with an old photo album. Not because I wanted to reminisce, but because I needed to remember who I used to be. Who we used to be. There were photos of my husband and me on our first vacation, arms around each other, tanned, carefree. I studied my own face as young, open, unaware of how quiet love could become. I felt a strange detachment, like looking at someone else's life. I heard him moving upstairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing. It sounded like packing. I closed the album. That evening, he didn't come down for dinner. I didn't go up to check. We stayed in our separate corners of the house, the silence now thick with the knowledge that soon it wouldn't be shared at all. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I missed it already. The days that followed carried an odd rhythm, both familiar, but hollow. My husband was still away, caught up in his obligations, calling once in the evenings with predictable timing and predictable phrases. "How's the house? Everything okay? Did you remember to fix the porch light?" I replied with a steady tone, matching his energy, saying yes and fine and sure, though none of those words ever really meant anything anymore. We hadn't had a real conversation in months, maybe longer. The house stayed quiet. Clean. Controlled. And yet, underneath all that calm, I felt like I was holding my breath. I caught glimpses of him, my stepson, here and there. In the hallway, the kitchen, the garden. Always just in passing. We exchanged simple nods or murmured greetings, both of us avoiding eye contact for more than a second or two. The tension didn't go away, it simply found places to hide. In the way I folded towels too carefully. In the way he closed doors a little too gently. In the space between us when we were alone in a room. I tried to distract myself with structure. Lists. Tasks. I organized the linen closet. Repainted the chipped baseboards in the upstairs hallway. Cleaned out the fridge and labeled leftovers. But every quiet moment between tasks left me exposed again, no barrier between me and the thoughts I was trying so hard to avoid. It wasn't desire that haunted me the most. It was the memory of being seen. Noticed. Not in the way strangers leer or husbands compliment out of habit, but truly seen, as if I was still capable of stirring something in someone. Even if that someone was the one person I wasn't supposed to matter to in that way. The moment that changed everything again started with nothing. I was in the living room, watering the houseplants, the sun pouring in through the front window in golden sheets. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of a radio playing from the kitchen. I thought I was alone. I didn't hear him come in. I didn't realize he was behind me until I turned to move to the next plant and nearly bumped into him. We both froze. "Sorry," I muttered. My hands tightened around the watering can. "No, I was just sorry," he said back. We looked at each other. Really looked. For the first time in days. I don't know which of us moved first. I don't know what thought I had that pushed me forward. All I know is that we were standing too close, and something cracked open between us like a seam under pressure. We kissed. No words. No warning. Just sudden and undeniable. It wasn't slow or dramatic. It wasn't planned. It just happened. And for one breathless second, the world fell away. Then it was over. We both stepped back like the ground burned beneath our feet. My heart was racing so loudly I could barely hear the silence that followed. My mouth was dry. His eyes were wide, not with regret, but confusion. A mirror of my own expression, no doubt. I shouldn't have," I started. He didn't finish his sentence. Neither did I. I turned and walked away. Not out of anger. Not even out of fear. I just needed air. I went upstairs, closed the door to the bedroom, and leaned against it with my eyes shut. I could still feel the imprint of his mouth on mine, the way it had felt both impossible and inevitable. For the next hour, I stayed in that room, curled into myself. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just tried to make sense of what I had done. Of who I had become. Later, I sat at my desk and opened my journal, a habit I'd abandoned years ago. I stared at the empty page, pen in hand, not knowing where to begin. Nothing sounded right. Nothing felt safe to admit. So I wrote the date at the top, then closed the book again. When I finally came back downstairs, the house felt colder. Not physically. Emotionally. As though even the walls understood that something had changed. He wasn't in the living room. Not in the kitchen. I checked the back door, it was unlocked, slightly ajar. I stepped out and saw him sitting at the far end of the garden, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. I didn't approach him. I stood there for a moment, watching. The light was fading, casting long shadows across the lawn. He looked smaller than usual, less certain, like a boy instead of the man I'd been trying not to see. I wanted to say something, but nothing came. So I closed the door gently and let the silence settle again. That night, I couldn't eat. I made soup, set the table, even poured a glass of wine out of habit. But I just sat there, staring at the bowl, unable to take a bite. Eventually I dumped it all into the sink, rinsed the dishes too loudly, and left the kitchen spotless. He didn't come down. I laid in bed for hours, eyes wide open in the dark, the ceiling a blank canvas for my racing thoughts. I didn't know what I wanted. Or what I expected. I only knew that what had happened couldn't be undone. That something had been set in motion, even if we both wished we could take it back. At some point in the early morning, I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. And when I woke up, the first thing I thought wasn't about what I'd done. It was that I didn't regret it. Not really. And that terrified me more than anything else. The morning after the kiss was quieter than usual, if that was even possible. The kind of quiet that pressed into your skin, that made every movement feel amplified. The clink of a spoon against a mug, the hum of the refrigerator, it all rang louder than it should have. I moved slowly, carefully, as though one wrong step might make the whole house collapse. He was already gone when I came downstairs. His room was empty, the bed made, no trace of him in the kitchen or the living room. I stood in the middle of the house, mug in hand, trying to decide if I felt relief or something else entirely. The absence was too complete, as if he had taken himself away to give me space. Or to punish himself. Or maybe just to avoid looking me in the eye. I spent most of that day in distraction. I pulled weeds from the garden until my knees hurt. I washed the windows. I cleaned out the coat closet and found a pair of my husband's gloves I hadn't seen in years. I held them in my hands for a long time before folding them neatly and placing them back on the shelf. He returned sometime in the late afternoon. I heard the door open but didn't turn to look. I was sitting on the porch steps, sipping tea that had gone cold. He didn't say anything as he passed behind me, only the soft sound of his footsteps on the wooden floorboards. I didn't call after him. I didn't ask where he'd gone. And he didn't offer. By dinner, the distance between us had solidified into something unspoken but impossible to ignore. We both pretended nothing had happened. Or rather, we both pretended that pretending was still possible. He sat across from me, eating quietly, his eyes rarely lifting from the plate. I asked if he wanted more salad, and he said no. That was the extent of our exchange. After the meal, he cleared his plate and left the room. I stayed behind, letting the silence breathe. The house felt like it was waiting for something, though I couldn't name what. I washed the dishes one by one, drying each with deliberate care. My hands moved automatically, but my mind was tangled in thoughts I couldn't organize. Later that night, I stood at the bedroom window, staring into the dark. The sky was clear, dotted with stars that seemed too bright for the weight I carried. My husband had sent a message earlier, a picture of his dinner, some hotel buffet, captioned with "Miss this homemade stuff." I replied with a smiley face, and that was that. There was a time when I would have written back more. A joke. A comment. A question about his day. But now, it all felt mechanical. We were maintaining the structure of a marriage, but the substance had long since eroded. At some point, I heard movement downstairs again. Soft, careful. I didn't check. I didn't want to know if he was pacing or packing or sitting alone like I was. I returned to bed and tried to sleep, but the sheets felt foreign, the pillows wrong. My body refused to settle. The next morning brought rain. Soft, steady, and cold. The kind of weather that seeps into your bones and makes you want to stay in bed all day. But I got up, dressed, and made breakfast. Out of habit. Out of the need for something to do. He didn't come down until nearly noon. His hair was damp, as if he'd just come in from outside. He looked tired. He looked like I felt. I thought you'd left, I said, without turning. I needed air, he replied. I walked to the park. I nodded. Stirred my tea. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then moved to the fridge, taking out the juice but not pouring any. Just holding it. I should probably go soon, he said quietly. I kept stirring. Maybe tomorrow. Or the next day. Still, I didn't answer. I didn't know how. I didn't know if I wanted him to go or stay or vanish entirely. I only knew that nothing felt simple anymore. That I had stepped into something I didn't know how to step out of. He eventually left the kitchen, and I stood there alone, the sound of the rain like static against the windows. That afternoon, the power went out. Just for a second, long enough for the lights to blink and the hum of the refrigerator to stop. I jumped at the sudden silence, then laughed at myself. I hadn't realized how tightly wound I was until that moment. When the lights came back on, I looked around the house as if expecting something to have changed. But everything was the same. The same rugs. The same fading photos on the walls. The same creases in the furniture. And yet, it all felt like it belonged to someone else now. Someone who still believed everything could be kept in its proper place. That evening, he joined me on the porch again. Not close. Not far. Just there. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of wet leaves and damp soil. We watched the sky shift from gray to blue to a murky twilight. Neither of us spoke. And for once, that silence didn't feel like tension. It felt like acknowledgement. When we went back inside, I expected the quiet to resume, to thicken. But something had softened. I didn't feel the same weight pressing against my chest. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was time. Or maybe we were both just too tired to keep pretending we weren't affected. I went to bed early. Not to sleep. Just to lie there, wrapped in the blanket, listening to the wind. I thought of the kiss again. Not with longing or regret, but with the quiet knowledge that it had happened and couldn't be undone. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew the waiting was over. One way or another, everything would shift again soon. The morning sunlight crept across the floorboards like it didn't know where it belonged. I watched the shadows stretch across the carpet from the armchair in the corner of the living room, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in my hands. The windows were open just a crack, enough to let in the faint hum of the outside world, the rustle of trees, the occasional car passing in the distance, the distant bark of a dog. Life outside the house moved on at its usual pace, unaware of the storm that had been quietly building inside. The night before hadn't ended with a word. It hadn't ended at all, not really. It simply dissolved into stillness. After he returned from his walk, we had barely acknowledged each other. And yet, when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening for his footsteps, waiting for some sign of resolution, or maybe escalation. But nothing came. Until it did. It was late, too late to mistake it for anything else, when I heard the soft knock on my door. Not loud, not urgent. A careful, measured sound. I didn't answer at first. I just sat up in bed, heart thudding in my chest, staring at the doorknob. Another knock followed. Then silence. I stood, walked slowly to the door, hesitated. And opened it. He stood there, barefoot, wearing a faded t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair was tousled, eyes heavy with something I couldn't define. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The pause between us was long. We both knew what it meant. We both knew what it would lead to. He stepped inside. We spent the night together. In the morning, I woke first. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. I didn't recognize the weight beside me, the rhythm of another person's breath. Then it all came flooding back, his presence, the decision, the way the room had felt heavier and lighter at the same time. He was still asleep, one arm resting across the sheet, his chest rising and falling steadily. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him. I slipped from the bed and walked to the window, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. Outside, the yard was damp with morning dew. The sky was pale, streaked with early clouds. The world looked unchanged, and yet I felt completely different. There was no guilt in me, not in the way I'd expected. There was sorrow, yes. Uncertainty. A deep, quiet ache that came from knowing something had shifted in ways that could never be undone. But guilt? No. That had faded sometime in the middle of the night, replaced by something more complex. Something I didn't yet have words for. I heard him stir behind me. The bed creaked slightly as he sat up. I didn't turn around. After a moment, he spoke. "Do you regret it?" His voice was soft. Careful. I closed my eyes, breathing in slowly before answering. No. Another pause. Me neither. I turned then, met his eyes. He looked vulnerable. Younger than usual. And for the first time, I realized how fragile this all was, how little either of us truly understood what we were doing. "I don't know what happens now," I said. "Neither do I." He rose from the bed, began collecting his clothes. I watched him move, every motion deliberate, quiet. There was no chaos in the aftermath. Just a strange kind of stillness, like the eye of a storm that hadn't finished spinning. We didn't say anything else. He left the room with a nod, closing the door behind him softly. I stood there for a long time, blanket still wrapped around me, feeling the weight of everything settle into my skin. By midday, the house felt surreal. The same walls, the same furniture, but none of it felt familiar. It was as if I was seeing everything through a filter, distorted, unfamiliar. I moved through the rooms like a guest in someone else's life. I avoided mirrors. I couldn't bear to see myself just yet. When my husband called, I let it go to voicemail. He left a message about coming home soon, about the weather being bad in the city and how he hoped the leak in the roof hadn't returned. He said he missed me. He sounded tired. I replayed the message twice, listening not for what he said, but for what he didn't. There was nothing in his voice that suggested he suspected anything. Nothing that hinted at change. And maybe that was the most painful part. The hours passed slowly. I baked, even though I wasn't hungry. I cleaned, even though the house was already clean. He stayed in his room most of the day. We passed each other once on the stairs. We didn't speak, but our eyes met briefly. There was no shame in it. No fear. Just acknowledgement. We both knew what had happened. And neither of us pretended otherwise. That evening, I sat in the backyard under the old tree, watching the sky shift from pale blue to deep purple. The wind picked up, brushing the leaves into small spirals across the grass. I wrapped my arms around myself and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar, a strange, quiet sense of being alive. Not happy. Not excited. Just awake. Present. Every part of me aware of the world around me. Of the way my skin felt against the fabric of my sweater. Of the air in my lungs. Of the thud of my own heartbeat. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how to move forward. But I knew I couldn't go back. Not entirely. And maybe that was enough for now. The following days passed with an unnatural stillness, like the quiet after a storm that had uprooted everything but left no visible damage. The house remained as it always had been, neat, orderly, filled with soft noises and natural light, but something had changed in the air. It was in the way I walked through each room, more slowly, more carefully, as if I was stepping through the remnants of something delicate and temporary. He kept to himself after that night. I didn't question where he went or what he did. I didn't ask if he was okay. There was no need for words. We had crossed a line neither of us had spoken of before, and now that we had, we were walking in its shadow, trying not to trip. I busied myself with things I had neglected. I rearranged the bookshelves in the hallway, alphabetized the spice rack, sorted through old boxes in the attic. Anything that required attention and filled time. The truth was, I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. I thought guilt would come and stay, but it didn't. I thought I would want to talk to him again, to make sense of it, but I didn't. I just wanted stillness. I wanted to breathe in silence for a while. When my husband returned, he brought with him the scent of hotel soap and car leather. He hugged me at the door like nothing had changed. His arms wrapped around me with practiced familiarity, and I hugged him back out of instinct. It felt strange, not because I didn't care for him, but because I realized how distant we had become. I had grown used to his absence, not just physically, but emotionally. He was here now, but it felt no different. He talked about his trip over dinner, about meetings, and weather and colleagues I barely remembered. I nodded, smiled, asked the right questions. I noticed how quickly he filled the silence. How he never once asked me how I was. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe I didn't want to tell him. Either way, we danced around each other like we always had. That night, we lay in bed with the space between us as wide as ever. He fell asleep within minutes, breathing heavy and even. I stared at the ceiling, the faint light from the hallway tracing shadows on the walls. I thought of what had happened in this same bed just nights before. The weight of memory pressed against me like a second blanket, one I couldn't throw off. In the morning, I got up early. I brewed coffee and stood at the kitchen sink, watching the light filter through the curtains. He came in minutes later, kissed my temple, and thanked me for the coffee. I smiled. Routine resumed, or at least the illusion of it. He returned to work, and I returned to pretending. I kept the house running. Made the meals. Watered the plants. Nothing outward had changed, and that was perhaps the strangest part. How something so significant could live invisibly between people. He and I, my stepson and I, barely spoke. When we did, it was formal. Measured. He kept his distance, and I let him. I didn't know how to be near him without the weight of that night between us. I didn't know how to see him without seeing what we had done. One afternoon, I found a pair of his socks in the laundry, mixed in with my husband's clothes. I held them in my hands longer than I should have, the fabric soft and worn. It was such a simple thing. A small thing. But it anchored me in a way nothing else had. It reminded me that we lived in the same space. That we had shared something real. Something that couldn't be erased by silence or politeness. Later that day, I saw him in the backyard, raking leaves into neat piles. I watched from the window for a few minutes, then turned away before he could see me. I didn't know what I would say if we met eyes. I wasn't sure I could trust myself to keep whatever boundaries were left. That evening, my husband suggested we go out for dinner. "It's been a while," he said, placing his hand over mine at the table. I agreed. We went to a quiet restaurant we used to visit often. The food was good. The conversation easy, if shallow. We talked about repairs the house might need before winter, about his parents, about how quickly the holidays were approaching. We didn't talk about us. We hadn't done that in years. He looked at me across the table and said, "You seem different." I tilted my head. Different how? I don't know. Quieter maybe. More thoughtful? I smiled and said, "Maybe I'm just tired." He accepted that answer without pressing. He always did. When we returned home, he went upstairs to shower. I stayed downstairs, walking through the darkened living room, letting my fingers trail along the edge of the couch, the bookshelf, the picture frames. Our life was so neatly arranged. From the outside, it would look perfect. Stable. Clean. But inside, it felt like a museum. Beautiful, but untouched. I sat down in the armchair and closed my eyes. For a moment, I imagined leaving. Packing a bag, getting in the car, and driving somewhere without looking back. But I wouldn't. I knew that. I wasn't built to run. I was built to endure. And sometimes, that was the harder thing. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen table in handwriting that wasn't mine or my husband's. It said, simply, "I'll be gone for a few days. Don't worry. I just need some space." There was no name. No explanation. I stared at it for a long time, the words burning into my mind. I folded it in half and tucked it into the drawer beneath the silverware. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't know if I would. I just made the coffee, like always. Sat at the table. And waited for the silence to start speaking again. The house was quieter without him, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet that settles over a place when someone leaves for vacation or the weekend. It was a hollow quiet, like something vital had been extracted. The air felt heavier, the rooms larger and less defined. I found myself listening for the sounds I had come to expect, his footsteps, the creak of the guest room floor, the sound of the back door opening in the early hours of the morning. But there was only stillness now. I didn't tell my husband about the note. I let him believe everything was as it had always been. When he asked if I had seen his son that day, I simply said, "Not yet," and he moved on, accepting my answer with the same distracted trust he always had. He wasn't the type to question what he didn't want to see. He had made a habit of not noticing. Maybe that had once served us both. Maybe now it was just convenient. I moved through the days as though I were living in a waiting room. I cooked, cleaned, answered emails, tended to the garden. But every action felt distant, like I was performing someone else's life. At night, I lay in bed beside my husband, staring at the ceiling while his steady breathing filled the space between us. I had memorized that ceiling. I knew every imperfection in the plaster, every faint discoloration. It had become my anchor, my canvas for thought. Sometimes I would find myself thinking about that night, the night that changed everything. Not with longing, exactly, and not with regret. It was more like turning over a memory to inspect it again, to see what I had missed the first time. The things that were said. The things that weren't. The silence afterward. The way the air had tasted different the next morning. And now he was gone. He didn't say how long he'd be away. There was no promise of return, no open door. Just the note and the absence. I found myself watching the driveway, listening for the sound of a car pulling in, footsteps on the porch. But days passed. No sign. Eventually, I stopped looking. Or at least, I tried to. My husband proposed we take a weekend trip to the coast. Just a few days, he said over dinner. We haven't done something like that in ages. I nodded, smiled, agreed that it sounded nice. But inside, I felt nothing. The idea of packing a bag, driving together, sharing a room, it felt like acting in a play I no longer believed in. Still, I went through the motions. I laid out clothes, booked a small rental cottage online, even prepared meals in advance for our return. It was all so familiar, and yet, I felt like I was doing it underwater. Everything muffled. Slower. On the morning of our trip, I woke early. The sky was pale and soft, just beginning to warm with sunrise. My husband was still asleep, curled on his side, facing away from me. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the back of his neck, wondering how long it had been since I'd really touched him. Not just brushed past or leaned in for a kiss goodbye, but really touched him with intention. I didn't know the answer. We drove in near silence. He made light conversation, traffic, gas prices, the weather. I responded with nods, small comments, but let him carry the weight of it. He didn't seem to notice my quiet. Or maybe he did, but chalked it up to tiredness. He'd gotten used to my silences over the years. It had become our mutual language. The cottage was pleasant. Cozy. Just off the beach. Inside, everything smelled faintly of salt and cedar. He unpacked while I walked through the rooms, touching surfaces, opening drawers, grounding myself in the newness of the space. We went for a walk along the shoreline that afternoon, shoes in hand, waves lapping at our ankles. I tried to remember how it felt to be present. To enjoy something without the constant hum of conflict underneath. It didn't work. That evening, we had dinner at a nearby restaurant. The food was fine. The wine dull. The conversation muted. He reached for my hand across the table, and I let him take it. His fingers were warm, familiar. But when he looked at me and said, "I've missed this," I couldn't bring myself to say it back. Instead, I smiled and looked away. That night, lying in bed beside him in the little cottage by the sea, I felt lonelier than I had in months. Not because I missed the person I had been with, but because I realized how little of myself remained in this relationship. We had built something stable, yes, but it no longer held life. It was like an old tree, rooted, unmoving, but hollow inside. In the early hours, I got out of bed quietly and stepped out onto the small porch. The air was crisp, and the waves rolled in softly in the distance. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat on the wooden steps, staring into the darkness. And I thought of him. Where he was. What he was thinking. If he would come back. If he wanted to. I thought about how I had changed. How something inside me had awakened, not because of the kiss, or the night we spent together, but because of what came after. The silence. The questions. The way I had begun to see myself not as a supporting character in someone else's life, but as someone with agency. With wants. With decisions yet to be made. When we returned home 2 days later, the house felt different. Not empty. Not full. Just waiting. There was no note. No message. No sign of return. But the bed in the guest room had been remade. And I knew, without needing to ask, that he had been here. Briefly. Quietly. And had left again. It had been 3 days since we returned from the coast. My husband was back into his work rhythm, early mornings, long phone calls, short dinners. His re-entry into our domestic routine was seamless, almost mechanical. He unpacked, did laundry, restocked the fridge. If he noticed the way I kept drifting off in the middle of his conversations, he didn't mention it. If he sensed a shift in me, however small, he ignored it. We moved around each other like planets, orbiting the same space but never truly touching. And yet, something lingered. Not just in me, but in the house itself. A kind of tension that wasn't loud or sharp, but low and humming. I could feel it in the quiet moments, when I passed the guest room, when I walked into the kitchen and caught a whiff of the familiar shampoo that hadn't belonged to my husband. I had checked the room the evening we got back, and it was unmistakable. The bed had been made differently. Not the way I usually tucked the sheets. One of the drawers was slightly ajar, and inside was a small stack of books that hadn't been there before. He had returned. Briefly. Silently. And left again. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't know what to say. The uncertainty gnawed at me. Not fear, he wouldn't expose anything, but a restless knowing. That he had been close enough to enter, to breathe the same air again, and had chosen not to speak. I wasn't sure if I should feel abandoned or respected. I spent more time alone after that. Not by avoidance, but necessity. I walked. I sat in the garden. I took drives to nowhere in particular, with the windows down and no music playing. I let my thoughts stretch in all directions, trying to make sense of the version of me I had become. What she wanted. What she could live with. One afternoon, I ended up at a bookstore. Not a place I usually visited. I wandered through the aisles without looking for anything, touching the spines absent-mindedly, reading first lines and back covers like I was searching for a story that would give me answers. I bought a notebook and a pen, though I hadn't written anything in weeks. That night, after dinner and the quiet clatter of dishes being put away, I went into the guest room. My husband was upstairs on a call. I knew I had time. I sat on the bed, the one he had made when he came back, and opened the notebook. I started writing. Not about the night. Not about the kiss. Not even about him. I wrote about myself. About the first time I realized I wasn't being seen. About how it happened slowly, not in some dramatic moment, but in a collection of forgotten glances and unanswered questions. About how I had built a life that looked complete, but felt hollow. About how I had tried to ignore that ache for years. How I had told myself it was normal. That this was what long relationships became. Stable. Predictable. Muted. But I wasn't muted anymore. Something had changed. Something in me had cracked open, and no amount of habit or politeness could close it again. The writing poured out in bursts. Some sentences were sharp. Others soft. I didn't edit or censor. I didn't think about what was fair or right or forgivable. I simply told the truth. When I finished, I didn't read it. I tucked the notebook into the drawer with the stack of his books and left the room quietly. The next day, I cleaned the house again. It didn't need it. I vacuumed rugs that were already clean, wiped down baseboards, polished silverware that never left its drawer. I kept my hands moving because my mind wouldn't stop. My husband worked from his office upstairs. The house was quiet except for the occasional tap of his keyboard and the soft murmur of his voice on conference calls. At one point, he came downstairs and asked if I wanted to go out for lunch. I said I wasn't hungry, and he didn't press. He kissed my cheek and left alone. I watched him through the window as he got into the car. For a moment, I felt a sting of guilt, not for what I had done, but for how far away I had drifted. I didn't hate him. I didn't even blame him. I just no longer felt like his. That evening, as the light began to fade and the air cooled, I sat on the back steps with a cup of tea. The yard was quiet. The trees barely moved. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime rang softly. I watched the shadows lengthen across the grass and let my body go still. I don't know how long I sat there. At some point, I heard the creak of the gate. I didn't turn around. I knew who it was. He walked slowly, stopping a few feet behind me. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. Minutes passed like that. Then he sat down beside me. Not close. Not far. Just enough. I glanced over. His eyes were tired. His jaw tense. He looked thinner, or maybe it was just the light. I read what you wrote, he said, voice low. I nodded. I didn't come back to talk about what happened, he continued. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I looked at my hands, fingers wrapped around the warm mug. I'm not sure I am. He didn't respond immediately. Then, me neither. We sat in silence again. The kind that had always been easier than speaking. But this time, it wasn't avoidance. It was understanding. After a while, he stood. I won't stay. I nodded. Okay. But if you ever want to see me, outside of all this, you can. I didn't look at him. I know. He left the way he came. Quietly. Carefully. And I stayed on the steps until the sky turned dark. That night, I didn't write. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. But I felt something shift. Not closure. Not peace. Just the beginning of something else. Something I hadn't named yet. But it was mine.